Quick, graph y equals 5/2 times the sine of x minus 2 by hand. Also graph y equals negative 5/2 times the sine of x minus 2. This is part of the family of functions series. You will need paper and straight edge. We suggest you create grids similar to the ones at the right as needed, and press pause as needed anytime during the video. All right, let's first analyze this. Notice that no parameters affect the x values. But which parameters affect the y values? That would be the 5/2 times and the minus 2. The 5/2 multiplies each y value by 5/2. The minus 2 subtracts 2 from each y value. By the order of operations, we multiply first and then subtract second. We need to look at the y values of the points of interest. So to do that, let's go ahead and recall the graph of y equals the sine of x, one period or one wave. Note the 5 key points of interest. These key points and all points are affected by the parameters in the equation. So the initial point, the origin, we multiply each of the y values by 5/2, then subtract 2. So 5/2 times this 0 minus 2 is negative 2. So that point is shifted to 0, negative 2. That will be our initial point. The end of the first period is normally at 2 pi 0, but we're going to multiply that 0 by 5/2 and subtract 2 and also get negative 2. But that point will now be shifted to 2 pi negative 2. Halfway between the start of the period and the end of the period is another point of inflection, which would be right here. And so normally at pi 0, but multiplying that 0 by 5/2 minus 2 again is still negative 2. So pi negative 2. Halfway between these two first points of inflection is going to be a maximum, which is normally at pi over 2, 1. But we're going to multiply that 1 by 5/2. So that'll be 5/2 minus 2, which we can think of as 4/2, leaves us positive 1/2. So pi over 2, comma 1/2. That's our new maximum point. And finally, halfway between these two points of intersection is going to be a minimum down here. Normally at 3 pi over 2, negative 1, but we're going to have to multiply that negative 1 by 5/2 and subtract 2. So that's negative 5/2 minus, think of 2 as 4/2. And we get negative 9/2. So 3 pi over 2, comma negative 9/2 plots right here. Pause is needed. We'll connect the points as a sine wave. We've got a concave down, then a concave up. This is one period of the wave. Let's duplicate that in the negative direction. So we'll go back a period, which is 2 pi. From each point, but especially the key points of interest. And we'll connect the points in another sine wave. Frown and then a smile. And there's our graph. We'd like to draw the line that contains the points of inflection. That will be the line y is equal to negative 2. And you can see where that negative 2 came from. We'll also figure out the amplitude. That's the distance from a max to the line containing the points of inflection, or a minimum to the line containing the points of inflection. That's 5/2. And again, we can see where that comes from in the equation. Pause is needed. So a bonus graph, let's graph y equals negative 5/2 times the sine of x minus 2. Recall that the graphs of these two are reflections of each other about the line that contains the points of inflection. We talked about that before. So this max will be reflected about the line containing points of inflection to become a min. This point of inflection stays there. It's its own reflection. This min reflects up to a max. Points of inflection stays. Max becomes a min. Point of inflection stays, and so on. So those blue points are on the y equals negative 5/2 sine of x minus 2. We can now connect those points as a sine wave, connecting the blue. So again, we got a smile, frown, and alternating smiles and frowns. Pause is needed. Let's go ahead and graph this using a table. So I'll start with our unit circle values, the ones on the axes. Go ahead and pause to complete the table. And we need to create a second table for the green equation. Identify the parameters, the 5/2 times and the -2. And again, neither of these affect the x values. So we can go ahead and just duplicate the x values here. We're going to multiply each y value by 5/2, then subtract 2. That's the order of operations. So 0 times 5/2 minus 2 would be 0 minus 2, or -2. And so we'll go ahead and plot that point, 0, -2. 1 times 5/2 is 5/2. Minus 2, think of 2 as 4/2. And so we'll get positive 1/2. So we'll plot pi/2, comma, positive 1/2. 0 times 5/2 minus 2 is -2. So pi -2. -1 times 5/2 minus 2 is -5/2 minus 4/2, which makes -9/2, or -4.5. So we'll plot 3 pi/2, comma, -4.5. And 0 times 5/2 minus 2 is still -2, 2 pi, comma, -2. Connect the points as a sine wave, frown, and then a smile. And then we can just take it as far as we can in this graph. Pause is needed. Now you try 2. We'd like you to graph this one and then this one as well, okay? Use either method or both for the practice. Pause is needed. Resume when you're ready. So here's y equals 3 sine x plus 1 in green. Here's y equals -3 sine x plus 1 in blue. And you can see when we graph them together, they are reflections of one another about the line containing the points of inflection, the line y equals 1.